Hölgyeim és uraim, professzor úr! Professzor úr az Rényi Miklós Nemzetvédelmi Egyetem és Pannon Egyetem meghívására érkezett Magyarországra, és nagyon örülök, hogy ezt a személyes meghívásunkat Földes György barátommal együtt elfogadta, és nem csupán egy egyetemi környezetben, hanem politika iránt különlegesen érdeklődők körében is tölt egy estét, és hajlandó egy beszélgetésre. Hát azt hiszem, ő az, akit a legkevésbé kell akadémiai módon bemutatni a világon, a társadalomtudomány iránt érdeklődők számára, hiszen nincs olyan európai egyetemista vagy olyan felnőtt, aki ne olvasta volna alapvető műveit. Nevezik hol történésznek, hol szociológusnak, hol közgazdásznak, de rájuk talán legjobban az a kifejezés, hogy társadalomtudós, hiszen a maga valóságában és a maga teljességében közelíti meg a világrendszereket. És amikor a könyveit először magyarul lehetett olvasni, nagyon sokak számára ez egy meghatározó élmény volt. Én nagyon örülök, hogy elfogadt ezt a meghívásunkat, és egy délutáni előadás után itt van közöttünk, és abban maradtunk, hogy inkább ő beszél. Én majd megkérem Földes György barátomat, hogy a beszélgetést moderálja. Most viszont a professzor urat kérem meg. The floor is yours, professzor úr. Parancsolj.
I was told this was going to be a discussion. We're a rather large group for a discussion, but I hope to make it that, because I don't want to talk very long. Yeah. This is, I take it, to talk on the present world situation. And let's start with the fact that the present world situation is a mess from beginning to end. We're in a very difficult situation. Most people, most analysts in the press and so forth discuss this as a financial crisis that began in 2008, something like that. A very limited way to look at the present situation. The fact is that this is merely the culminating phase of something that's been going on since about 1970. You have to start with something very elementary, how capitalism works. You don't make profit in capitalism if you have a competitive situation. You have a competitive situation, then the buyers can force the sellers down to a very minimal price, which is not very helpful if you want to make profit. The only way you can really make profit in capitalism is if you can get a quasi-monopoly. Getting a quasi-monopoly is not all that easy, but it happens with some regularity. That some firms in some countries get hold of a relatively new product, which is called technically a leading product, and they have a quasi-monopoly on it. And if you have a quasi-monopoly on it, you can charge an awful lot to sell it, and you can make considerable money. And this is how capital is accumulated. Technically, this this is what happens in the so-called Contrarian A phase. And from 1945 to 1970, we have the single biggest Contrarian A phase in the history of the world economy. It was quite incredible. It was really a situation where all ships were rising, standards of living were going up everywhere, and people were making, and big capital was making an immense amount of money. The problem with quasi-monopolies is quasi-monopolies are self-liquidating, inevitably. Because if you have a product which makes an awful lot of money, then other people would like to be able to produce that same product. And it's very sensible. They try to get into the market. There are all sorts of ways of keeping them out of the market, political and economic, but eventually, by one means or another, more people get into the market, usually in countries other than in the main countries where the product is being produced, or most of it is being produced. And so we get competition, and competition brings down the price. There's no question, as you know, the neoliberals always tell us, that competition does bring down prices. It also brings down profits. That's the trouble with bringing down prices, it brings down profits. At a certain point, basically, you've got to, if there are too many people in the market, it isn't a profitable product anymore. So there are lots of things you can do about it. Like you can try to move your production area to other zones of the world economy where wages are, for various historical reasons, lower, and that happens. It's called development in those other areas, but actually it's just shifting a less profitable product to another part of the world. But the main thing that capitalists do is that they move from the sphere of making money through production to the sphere of making money through finance. And finance is a fancy word for speculation. And the way you speculate is you create debtors. And debtors, the trouble with being in debt is essentially you have to pay back the debts, and you collapse. And what happens in these second periods, which are called the B periods, is you get stagnation in the world economy. You get rising unemployment, and you get shifting debtors. So from about 1970 to today, we've had this pattern of shifting debtors. And the first group were third world and socialist countries who borrowed money from the banks who raked it in because of the oil price rise. And by 1980s, we had the so-called debt crisis. People usually trace that to Mexico in 1982. I trace it to Poland in 1980. And I think that was a typical debt crisis in which the Gehrig government tried to squeeze the workers, and the workers rebelled. That was called solidarity. And we had to find new debtors. And the new debtors turned out to be corporations who created junk bonds, and that collapsed. And then there were the new debtors who were consumers who borrowed more and more money, and then the governments who borrowed more and more money, and the U.S. government became an enormous debtor, and then we got to 2008. And we had the collapse of the debtors who had invested in real estate and who had invested in all sorts of other things. Suddenly people noticed that there was a so-called crisis. And what did the world do about it? They created a new set of debtors. Who is the latest set of debtors? The latest set of debtors is the U.S. government, which is printing money. It's called, what do they call it? I forget what they call it, but they give this money to the banks, which make them survive another year or two. But the trouble is, and it does save some jobs and so forth. It could be worse, except that this money is running out, and the U.S. Congress isn't going to vote significant amounts more. And most of the state governments in the United States have run out of money. Lots of European countries have run out of money. In fact, we're about to have further collapses. What's happening in Greece is only the thin edge of a big collapse. So we haven't ended this crisis yet. The biggest one is yet to come, and the last thing that's holding it up is the U.S. Dollar, which has been losing ground for 30 years, but still is the main reserve currency, and when that ceases to be the case, then we have a real super crash. So that's where we are. And we're in a rather chaotic situation in which all the governments of the world, practically, have less income, more unemployment, and as a consequence, more demands on expenditures with less money to pay for the more demands on expenditures, which creates a crisis for one government after another, because what can you do? You can raise your taxes to get more income, but will that be more income if enterprises disappear on you and go to other countries? Or you can cut on already difficult welfare situation even more, and you might have popular revolts, which the Greek government is already seeing, and which is happening in other countries. So you have a situation in which the governments have no good solution. So what do? They all engage in increased protectionist behavior. Whether they say so or not, that's what they're all doing. And the reason is very simple. They're responding to political pressure within their country to hold some jobs that they might otherwise lose if they didn't have this protectionist policy. But of course, protectionism works in the short run, but it never works in the middle run. It just makes the situation worse. And there we are. We're in generalized chaos. Where we go from here, that combined with a multipolar situation, rapidly declining U.S. strength, militarily, geopolitically, and economically, is anybody's guess. Not easy. Because it's an unpredictable situation. It's an unpredictable situation at the level of governments. It's also an unpredictable situation at the level of individuals. Where do you put your money? You know, if you have any amount of money, you put it in euros, in dollars, in yen, in renminbi. I don't know how to give you good advice on that, because it can go up and down with great speed. And unless you're a very clever player of the world market, and there are only a few very clever players of the world market, you make mistakes at the small level, at the middle level, at the big level. So that's where we are. Maybe that's good enough as opening remarks, and then I could have some discussion with you about where we are.
Köszönjük szépen. Láthatóan a professzor úr arra törekedett, hogy nyitva hagyja a teret is, meg az időt is, és ezáltal az is kiderül, hogy a mi gondolkodásunkra is kíváncsi. Hadd emlékeztessek arra, hogy Immanuel Wallerstein már akkor is rendszerben gondolkodott a világról, amikor még a globalizáció fogalma nem uralta el a társadalomtudományokat és a közpolitikai gondolkodás sem. Tehát azok a bevezető szavak nem igyekeztek, azt hiszem jobban mondom, hogy nem akartak teljes képet festeni, hanem a fő problémára irányították a figyelmet. Ezért tehát arra kérek mindenkit, hogy éljen a lehetőséggel, és a kérdéshez módja van a saját nézeteit is röviden megjelezni. Elnézést kérek a tolmácsoktól, hogy megkövettem ezt a hibát, pedig már azt hittem magamról, hogy már félig profi vagyok, de talán negyedik sem. Úgyhogy azt hiszem azért érthető volt. Úgyhogy akkor kikezdeni. Tessék, Bancsó, mindenkit kérek, hogy mutatkozzon be, és a tolmácsok kedvéért kellene segíteni és mikrofont adni a tisztviselőnek.
So I will give my question in English, okay, it's not a problem. First of all, I have a short question, which is the first Great Depression, which was in 1929, that was born a new state. I mean, the state was born much stronger than before was happened at any time. And my question is now, which is this crisis, which happens nowadays and recently, which we can see now in the markets, which is called a depression 2.0. Don't you think that is a 2.0 depression, which is now, which we see now? Don't you think that the state will be changing also and will be stronger, or you can see that the state will be on the same level or will be much stronger? What you see in the world area of this one? Thanks.
Well, first of all, 1929 was not the first depression, and first of all, 1929 is the wrong year. That depression started in 1920. 1929 is like 2008. It's when people noticed it, because something had been happening already for 9 or 10 years. And then it suddenly got worse in terms of unemployment and so forth. We had an enormous depression. Actually, it's called the Great Depression in the economic history textbooks from 1873 to 1896. And Great Depressions are a regular phenomenon. That was one of the things I was trying to say. You have the contrariety of A periods, then you have the B periods, and the B periods are these periods which sometimes get called depression, sometimes get called other things, but all have the same characteristic, which is A, increased unemployment, B, relocation of world industries as the formerly profitable ones move to other parts of the world. 3, the more powerful countries all try to, more powerful economically speaking, more powerful countries all try to not have, how shall we say, it doesn't go from all to zero, it goes down the various income. And what the powerful countries try to do is export unemployment to each other. The other should suffer, not our country, and that's a tricky game. This is a regular phenomenon, and it's perfectly true that there has been a pattern over historical time in a capitalist system to strengthen the state structures. They have grown stronger. That assumes that we're going to continue this pattern of contrariety of A and B periods, of hegemonic rises and hegemonic declines. These are the normal patterns of capitalism. And that assumes that capitalism will go on forever. I think it will go on forever. I think, in fact, we're moving into the structural crisis of capitalism as a system, which is different from a contrariety of B period, and is different from a declining hegemonic power. And that has to do with the fact that the system is over time moving far from equilibrium and is getting too far off for it to be brought back to a moving equilibrium. That has to do with the ways in which the basic costs of capital have been rising over for 500 years and are reaching limits, asymptotes, such that capitalism as a system is no longer capable of permitting capitalists to make real money in a capitalist system. So we're in a structural crisis which can go on for 20, 50 years. It has been going on, it seems to me, for some time now, in which the issue is not whether we restore state power or move to another hegemonic power, but what kind of system will succeed capitalism. And that's another long story. I have written about that a number of times, but I think that's it. And that's why the biggest Kondratiev A period and the strongest hegemonic power in the history of world capitalism resulted in the biggest collapses, making it very difficult to get out of this situation that we're in now.
Professzor úr, azt szeretném megkérdezni, hogy az ilyen kis országoknak, mint Magyarország, milyen lehetőségei vannak és milyen jövője lehet, és ön szerint mennyire jók azok az intézkedések, amit a válsággal kapcsolatban hoztak Magyarországon, illetve a környező országokban összehasonlítva ezt a dolgot. Köszönöm szépen.
I'm not sure what measures you're referring to, but basically real statistics are quite limited in their accuracy, and lots of the statistics that you see published are outright lies. They're manipulated. So the confidence you can put into the published data is limited. It's not zero, because there are enough counter checks that if you read enough and read, count, and use, you might come close to some judgment. But you have to be careful about that. We are just today, these last 2 weeks or so, reading about how Goldman Sachs helped the Greek government of 8 years ago or whatever fudge its figures by playing some little game lending money which wasn't really lending money, but it got recorded in a different way than the others, so that Greece showed final figures to the rest of the European countries which were inaccurate, etc., etc., etc. So that kind of game is standard fare. Now, what room is there for Hungary? Well, it depends what you mean by room for Hungary. Hungary is a small country. Hungary is, some countries are located in better geographic positions than others, which gives them more leeway. Hungary is not well located. You're stuck between Western Europe and Russia, and you don't have much maneuverability, really, especially if the Western Europeans and the Russians make a deal, which I think they will, or are in the process of doing. In which case, you'll probably have to go along. with whatever deal they make. Now, if your question is, can Hungary improve its economic situation? Well, I don't know how many of you were at my other talk just before, but I said that I got that same question, and my answer was, every country, without exception, especially if they're not particularly wealthy at the moment, has an ideal in mind. I call it, we want to be Denmark. Why Denmark? Denmark is a small country. 150 years ago, it was nothing but an agricultural country. It was a poor country. Today, Denmark is a very wealthy country. Its citizens have one of the highest standards of living in the world. It's a wonderful place to be, etc., etc., etc. And Hungary would love to be Denmark. So would Bulgaria, so would Paraguay, so would Cambodia. Everybody wants to be Denmark. Right? Now the question is, can everybody be Denmark? Answer, no. Just not possible. That is to say, within the framework of capitalism, everybody can't be Denmark, because capitalism is a polarizing system. It depends on the fact that there are wealthy countries and very poor countries. If there weren't very poor countries, there wouldn't be very wealthy countries. There's a transfer of real capital that's constant. You can change your position. Some countries can improve their position, while other countries worsen their position. That's quite possible. So one reasonable question is Hungary in a position relative to other countries to improve its economic position at this present time? I'm not sure. I don't think so, really, to be honest. I think you are probably more or less stuck at the economic level that you are. Your best hope is not to be in a worse position. That's not very encouraging, I know, but think of it from the point of view of the United States. We're going to be in a worse position, and that's one of the big political problems in the United States. People really know that. The standard of living actually has gone down in the last 30 years, and the prospects are that it will go down more in the next 30 years. So if you stay in the same position, you're really doing quite well. You're not going to become Denmark. I hate to tell you this. And nobody likes me when I tell them that. And they all want to know what I would do as Minister of National Economy. And I can give you the answer that Paul Sweezy gave 50 or 60 years ago. Someone said to him, if you were named president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, what would you do? He said, resign.
Tessék.
Fekete Mihálynak hívnak. 1929-ben még csak gazdasági válság volt, most demográfiai válság is van, globalizációs válság van, felmelegedés van, tehát olyan egymástól részben független problémák adódnak, amelyek önmagukban is hatalmas problémák. Azóta van atomfegyver a Földön, és egyre több országnak van ilyen. Tehát ezen a gazdasági válságon belül még gyengülnek a lehetőségek szerintem arra, hogy megoldhatóvá váljanak. Mi erről az ön véleménye? Köszönöm.
Makes it harder. Look, you're quite right. It isn't that there wasn't an ecological crisis in 1929. It's that no one thought there was an ecological crisis in 1929. There's been an ecological crisis for the last 500 years because basically what we have been doing is externalizing the costs of ecological costs. Basically, there are three kinds of costs which you have been externalizing for 500 years. One is dealing with toxic waste. There's always toxic waste. The way it's been handled for the last 500 years is to throw it into the river, right? You throw the toxic waste into the river, and then you don't have to worry about it. Well, we throw it into enough rivers, you see, after 500 years it adds up. That's where we are today, but we've been throwing it. The other cost that we've been externalizing is renewing resources. We've been cutting down trees for 500 years. You know, in the 16th century, all of Ireland's trees were cut down. Okay, well that was Ireland. And then, you know, bit by bit, suddenly people say, oh my God, the Brazilian rainforest is the last one left. Now we're worried about it. Okay, sure, but it's already for 500 years, you see. So, yes, so that makes it much worse. And there's no solution within the framework of capitalism, because the only solution, right, for the ecological crisis is hey, start renewing resources, detoxify, which costs an awful lot of money, which means either you increase taxes enormously, and that's going to decrease profits, or you ask companies to internalize those costs, and they say, quite reasonably, that if we do that, we can't make profits. That's true, but then what do? Well, what you do is what you did in Copenhagen. Nothing. That's what happened in Copenhagen. Nothing. And if we have another Copenhagen conference 2 years from now, God knows where, maybe in Budapest, nothing. Because it's absolutely incompatible. I mean, you can tell the Chinese that they should, you know, put carbon limits, and they say, yeah, but that means our standard of living will be still lower than that of the United States. So, if the United States would like to, you know, shift 50% of its money to China, maybe we'll put carbon limits. Well, you know, I mean, these are politically impossible situations in which there is no solution within the framework. Now, the solution is what the Latin Americans, and especially the indigenous peoples, are now calling buen vivir, to live correctly. To live correctly means growth is not your objective. Your objective is somehow to balance things between generations and future generations, but that's a different kind of system. If you want to create that kind of system, we can solve that problem. Will this thing blow up in our face before we solve that problem? May well. You know, maybe in 2030 we're beyond the ecological point. I don't know. It's possible. The demographic crisis, well, population of the world has been growing for a long time. It's out of hand now. I was just reading today, just saw some figures between 1970, I think, and today. We have nearly doubled world population. Now, we have done some limitation on carbon output, but the actual per capita carbon imprint is greater, not enormously greater, but a little bit greater than it was in 1970. And we've got twice as many people, you know, and we're looking forward to having another 50% increase or something like that, by 2050. So, I mean, will we solve that problem? I don't know, you know. And you talk about nuclear weapons. I think we're in for nuclear proliferation. I would predict quite confidently that within 15 years there'll be 25 nuclear powers in the world. Will that mean more nuclear explosions? Well, I don't see any reason per se. That is to say, I don't think that any of these many countries that will become nuclear powers are totally irrational and mad. They want it as a defensive threat. That is to say, if you step on my toe, I can step on your toe, so nobody steps on anybody's toe. But can there be a lunatic who gets hold of these things? Can there be non-state powers that get hold of these things? Of course, it's quite possible. I can't guarantee you that there won't be some kind of nuclear explosions of major catastrophic things 20 years from now. It might happen. So all of these things might happen. Huh? We live, that's part of the chaotic situation in which we live. What I can think is that chaos doesn't go on forever. Quite a lot of experience with the analysis of these things. The title of one of Prigozhin's books in English was Order Out of Chaos, which summarizes the assumption that in a chaotic situation, eventually you have a bifurcation and the thing tilts at one point or another into some new order. Will this order be better or worse than what we have now? 50-50. Might be better, might be worse. Right? But it may well be orderly. And it may solve some of these problems. You know, I'm not Merlin the magician. I can't predict what the world will be like in 2050. What I can say is, I can guarantee you, it won't be like what it is today. That is to say, we won't have a capitalist world economy, but we'll have something else. And will that solve demography, global warming, nuclear weapons? Maybe. You know. Now, maybe is better than certainly not. Okay? People always ask me, am I an optimist or a pessimist? And I say 50-50. But 50-50 is a lot, not a little. In that sense, I'm an optimist.
Professzor úr azt írja, hogy a baloldali erők globálisan megosztottak, nem elég szervezetek és belharcok dúlják. Milyen belharcokra gondol, és ön szerint hogyan lehetne globális szinten a baloldali erőket jobban megszervezni? Egyáltalán beszélhetünk-e ma globálisan baloldali erőkről, vagy civil társadalomról, vagy ilyenről? Lehet-e valaha is olyan szervezet globálisan a baloldal, mint ma mondjuk a tőke? Főleg, hogyha arra gondolunk, hogy Nyugat-Európa, Amerika, meg hát Közép-Európa is a munkások a bérversenyben vannak a fejlődő országokkal. Hogyan lehet ilyen keretek között egy ilyen önszerveződést megvalósítani?
Well, first of all, let me say, it's absolutely true that the global left is a complicated, messy, uncoordinated entity. But the global right is not much better, if you take comfort in that. The global right is deeply divided between 2 points of view. There's the point of view which says repress, hit him over the head. You want to call that fascism, you can, except fascism was an historical phenomenon of a particular type. It may not be look the same way, but they give no quarter. Dick Cheney in the United States is a good representative of this point of view. But there's a view on the right, whatever name you want, which says, no, that's not the solution at all. The solution is co-optation. The solution is, it's really the, what do you call it, solution? The solution of what's the Italian author that book about Sicily. It's where the young Garibaldian confronts his landowning grandfather to explain why he's a Garibaldian, and he says, "Grandfather, everything must change in order that nothing change."
Lampedusa.
Lampedusa, thank you. That's the Lampedusa doctrine, okay? There are a lot of people out there who have the Lampedusa doctrine and who want to present themselves as revolutionary reformists. We're going to change the world, it's very progressive, and so forth and so on, but we want really to maintain a hierarchical, polarizing structure in which there will be a meritocracy and we will constantly co-opt the brighter people from the lower strata. They might win out, and that would be one version of the right. Or we might have the Dick Cheney version of the right. They are not at all in agreement, and all you need to do is try to follow kinds of debates at Davos, and you see that debate is going on quite fiercely. And you can see it within the United States. You can see it in terms of what's happening between the Republican Party and those on the right who now are calling themselves the Tea Party people and so forth. This is American politics at the moment, but I mean, the ferocity of their anger at each other is enormous, right? We are having one primary after another within the Republican Party between these two versions of the right. So they're not united, okay? But on the left, it's also true that the left forces in the world are not at all united. And there's an enormous group all over the world who have derived a lesson from the last 150 years of the failures of the world left, which is, first of all, very bottom-up and very dubious about acquiring state power within the present structure, and very strong on the emphasis of being against economic growth per se, and so forth. And it takes immense numbers of different forms, because these people are in different kinds of organizations. I mean, feminist organizations, they can be in environmental organizations, they can be in labor organizations, they can be in all kinds of organizations. And some of them are very local, some of them are national, some of them are regional, they're all over the place. And they have one thrust that's there, it's very real. Then there's another thrust that's there that says, you're crazy, this will never work, you have to somehow get hold of state power again, and use it to create a new world order, and so forth, and this anti-growth business is romanticism, and so forth and so on. This debate is a very ferocious one. You see it in every meeting of the World Social Forum. I've been to several of them, and it goes on with great vigor. You see it now in the whole debate about the so-called Fifth International, which Chavez convened, and who's going to be in the Fifth International. For example, can Fourth International parties be in the Fifth International? One of the questions being asked. Can little movements be in the Fifth International? Is the Fifth International a top-down structure or so forth? All totally unresolved. At the moment, but it's a thrust. So they're not resolved, and they don't have much patience for the first group of people. Well, now, so already this is a monstrously complicated situation. And all I can say is we have to navigate it. We have to attempt to bring together the forces of the world left as best we can to counteract the forces of the world right, because that's what the basic bifurcation is about. Whatever the names they give it, that's what it's about. And whether we'll tilt in one direction or the other depends on what all of us do. Look, you know, there's one comforting feature which I like to bring attention to. As long as a historical social system is functioning normally, as capitalism has been functioning for 500 years, it has its rules, we can explain them, we can understand how it operates and so forth. As long as it functions normally, it's really a very determinist system in one very simple sense, that no matter how much social energy you put into changing it, it gets pulled back to equilibrium. Take the two famous revolutions, the French and the Russian. And the fact is that both had enormous input of energy, of social energy. People really threw themselves into it and did it. And at the end, if you look back, how much was changed? I have a very Tocquevillian view of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. I mean, they fulfilled von Witte's attempt to industrialize, but did they change the world? No. So, you know, it's like that famous quip, sometimes attributed to Joe and Rye. What do you think of the French Revolution? It's too early to tell. Okay? All right. So it's a very, there's not much room in that for real human input that changes things. However, when the system is in structural crisis, what that means is that we move far from equilibrium, that every little input has enormous impact on the situation. It's the so-called butterfly effect, right? The butterfly its wings over here. At the other end of the world, the whole climate changes because one little butterfly moved. Well, I translate that into ancient philosophical language of the Western world. Right? And it's not a question as is the world determinist or is there free will? It's a matter of historicizing it. It's determinist when the systems operate normally. There's free will when the system is in structural crisis. So we're in structural crisis. Free will abounds. That is to say, we are all little butterflies. And every action by us, every little action, big action, every moment of our lives transforms the situation. That's why you can't predict how it will come out. I can't begin to calculate how 6 billion people will operate at every moment in their lives over the next 10 years. But it adds up to something. If it adds up to enough, we win. If it doesn't add up to enough, we lose. It's as simple as that. So, go you forth, all ye little butterflies, and flap your wings, is my message to you.
Valóban a Politikatörténeti Intézet. Professzor úr, egy lazább kérdésem lenne, ha megengedi. Most játsszák a magyar mozikban a Michael Moore-nak a filmjét, a Capitalismus szeretem címmel, nyilván ön látta. A kérdésem igen rövid, bár 2 részből áll. Az egyik az, hogy az ott látható politikai attitűdök és társadalmi attitűdök mennyire általánosak ma Amerikában, vagy mennyire folklorisztikusnak tekinthetők, egyébként Michael Moore-ral együtt, ez az egyik kérdésem. A másik, hogy osztja-e ön azt a optimista véleményt, ami ebből a filmből Obama elnökkel kapcsolatban kicseng, vagy kitetszik. Ez a két kérdésem lenne. Köszönöm szépen.
Well, I haven't seen the Michael, so I hesitate. Michael Moore, I have seen other movies of his, and he has been a very good interviewer, and he's exposed a lot of things by his clever and intelligent interviewing. I'm not sure he's a great analyst. And you asked me, are those attitudes typical of the U.S.? I'm not sure which attitudes they are, so I hesitate to answer. Now let me talk about Obama, since I get constant questions and flack about Obama, okay? I voted for Obama. I never had any hesitation in voting for Obama. However, before January 2008, there were 3 major candidates in the Democratic primaries: Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John Edwards. I didn't really like any of them, to be honest. I didn't think any of them really offered a program that I would be enthusiastic about, and I was having a hard time deciding which of the 3 I would favor. I certainly believe that in the American system, whoever is president matters, and that in the American system, you can't possibly elect a third-party candidate. There's no way you can do it, and therefore, if you vote for somebody like Ralph Nader, you're just throwing a vote to the Republicans, and the Republicans are worse. What happened in the United States was in January 2008, Obama won, narrowly, but won the Iowa primary, caucus. Now, what was significant about that was that Iowa is an absolutely white state. I think it's got 1% African Americans in it. And, you know, it's really as white a state as we have in the United States. And it's a fairly rural state, and so forth. And he won it. Now, that surprised everybody. I maybe didn't surprise Obama, but it certainly surprised everybody else. And what happened at that point is that the African American population suddenly said he might be elected. If he can win Iowa, maybe we should. Now, most of them have been committed to Hillary Clinton. Well, most of the African American politicians had been, prior to that point, committed to Hillary Clinton for all sorts of historical reasons. They had made public statements, they had made promises, and they all suddenly switched. They all switched because electing a black president was a socially meaningful thing to do. Okay? It was. And I don't know how many of you, or any of you, watched the inaugural ceremonies, but, you know, there were tears in people's eyes, and they were genuine. I mean, it was an important moment in the history of the United States. And the question is, does it make any difference? Well, it makes a real difference socially. Right? It's a barrier that's broken. Okay? But what's his policy? Now, I said before he was elected, look, he's not going to change foreign policy because basically he wants to go back to Clinton's policy, and Clinton's policy could have worked if he had been the president after Clinton. But George W. Bush ruined that for him. He created such a collapse of the U.S. position in the world that Clinton's policy was simply an unworkable policy. He can't change it, and he doesn't intend to change it, and he hasn't changed it. He's following Clinton's policy. I said, secondly, he can't change the world economy because no president of the United States today has enough power to really change what's going on in the world economy. So if you want to vote for him in order to change foreign policy or in order to change the world economy, you're going to fool yourself. You're not going to do it. I mean, it's not that it wouldn't have been worse, right, if we had, what's his name? His opponent from Arizona. McCain would bomb Iran. Obama wouldn't bomb Iran. That's a plus. It really is a plus, you know. Don't sneer at it. But not more than that. We're going to pull out of Iraq because we had no choice. But George W. Bush was going to pull out of Iraq too, actually. He just didn't say so. We're going to pull out of Afghanistan, but when nobody's saying so. The people who come closest to saying so now are the military who want us to be in there, and who are now weaseling in their words, and I can predict comfortably we're going to pull out because the U.S. isn't strong enough to stay there, because U.S. public opinion doesn't really want them to be there, but doesn't want them out either. See? So why vote for Obama? Well, I said he can do two things. One, he can do some social democracy. He can improve health and such things. Well, he just tried. He's just failed. So the one thing I thought he could do, he didn't do. And the second thing I said, that's a question mark, is he can improve the civil rights situation. What the Justice Department is doing under Bush was ghastly, and so forth. And he promises to close down Guantanamo, and he promises to do this and that. Is he doing it? Only a little bit. He's got an attorney general who wants to do it, and they're trying to hold him back from doing it. So his record isn't that good on the few things that I thought he could do. On the other hand, I'm certainly not going to vote for Sarah Palin as a result. And I'm not going to abstain. If I have to choose between Obama for a second term and Sarah Palin, I'm not going to say because Obama flunked the test. I used to give him B+, now I give him B- in grade. It doesn't mean that I'm out of my mind and that I'm going to elect Sarah Palin. So there you are. I've got limited choices. You've got limited choices as Hungary. I've got limited choices as an American citizen. There's just so much I can do within the electoral system. I mean, you know, I could run for president myself, but nobody would vote for me. And that's the reality.
Üdvözlünk, hogy hány kérdést engedélyez. Megértőek akarunk lenni, hát ez kell.
Yes, maybe two.
Szép.
Two.
Akkor tegyék fel a kezét az, aki még kérdezni szeretne, hogy hagyjunk kényeskedhessen. Nőknek. Tessék parancsolni.
Anita Szűcs, University of Economics International Relations Department. My question is that you wrote several times that we are in a period of transition, and the secular trend isn't The cycle is ending as well, and in this period, China is an emerging hegemonical power. Do you see any traces of a new logic, different than the modern world economy, different than the capitalism?
You mean from China?
No, as a new system, traces of a new system, new logic, different than the capitalist.
Yeah, I do, but I mean, it isn't decided yet. That was the point I was trying to make, that we're going to have something other than capitalism, but what will we have? It could be worse, it could be much better. What I define as much better is vague. That is to say, I refuse to put the standard labels on it. I say it has to be a relatively democratic, relatively egalitarian system. What the structures of such a system would be, and what the institutional structures would be, is impossible to predict. I often say, look, suppose we sat around in the late 15th century and said, oh, feudalism is collapsing. What's going to succeed it? Okay? And somebody raises his hand and said, well, we're going to try capitalism as a system. And you say to this person in 1450, and what will capitalism look like as a system? What will its structures be? Who in 1450 could possibly have imagined the complex set of structures which we have today? It's just not reasonable. All you can say is, this is the direction things are moving in. These are the basic principles, and people will work out the structures and develop them, and these are not predictable things. So I can't predict what a better world system will look like in institutional terms. I can't tell you whether we're going to have states of the kind that we have had within the capitalist system. I don't know. I don't know what kinds of economic structures it will have. I can just say, if it moves in the direction of being relatively democratic and relatively egalitarian, I'll be happy. And more than that, in the year 2010, not only I, but no one else can predict.
Ez az utolsó, tessék onnan adja. Azóta hölgyek kapják az utolsó.
Köszönöm szépen, Anna Mária vagyok, és pontosan ehhez a kérdéshez szeretnék egy megjegyzés és egy kérdést intézni. Az egyik, hogy ahhoz, hogy elinduljunk, hogy mégis milyen irányban találhatjuk meg a kapitalizmusnál jobb rendszert, fel kellene tudni tenni a helyes kérdéseket, és egy illusztrációt hozok erre. A kapitalizmusban arról beszélnek, hogy demográfiai probléma van, ezt a fejünkbe verték, tehát hogy baj, hogy előrekszik a társadalom. Nem ez a baj, hanem az a baj, hogy a tőke érdeke abban áll, hogy egyre kevesebb embert foglalkoztasson. A társadalom átlag életkorának a növekedése, az nem probléma, az egy csodálatos fejlődés az emberiségnek. Egy munkaórára valóban több eltartott jut, de az egy munkaóra sokkal termelékenyebb, mint korábban. A Földön abból a termékmennyiségből és szolgáltatás mennyiségből, amit most előállítunk, mindenki a magyar átlag színvonalon élhetne. Tehát az egy, és még sorolhatnék csomó ilyen téveszmét. Ez a megjegyzésem. Ami arra mutat, hogy mégis milyen irányba kell akkor elindulni, hogy a társadalmi munkaerő alappal kell gazdálkodnunk. A kérdésem pedig a következő, hogy azért egyetlen egy társadalmi formáció sem halt el, anélkül, hogy ehhez társadalmi csoportok ne segítették volna hozzá. Ez azt is jelenti, hogy a kapitalizmus, amelyik azért egy különösen virulens társadalom, és mindig megtalálta a kiutat a válságból eddig, az még találhat új területeket, amivel meghosszabbítja ezt az alulmát a jobb társadalomig. Emlékeztetnék arra, hogy 29-33 után végsősorban az USA-t nem a Keynesi politika, hanem a második világháború húztak ki a pangásból. Lát-e arra lehetőséget, hogy vagy esetleg más módon új iparágak felfedezésével a kapitalizmus még egy kört fut, mielőtt átadja a jobb rendszernek.
I don't know what running another round really means. My general point is that it's not only the left which is unhappy with capitalism, it's the capitalists at the moment who are unhappy with capitalism because they can't, I argue, make real, they can't accumulate significantly. And accumulate is, as Marx reminded us, the motto. And if you can't accumulate properly, reasonably, well, then you look for something else. So the idea that it's, how shall I say, the working classes who are going to overthrow capitalism leaves out the fact that capitalists also are turning from capitalism. And that's what creates this structural crisis. And but they don't therefore want to have a socialist world. That's not their objective when they are unhappy with it. They want one in which they can still accumulate large amounts of something. It may not be called capital, but they do want an egalitarian world. And as for your first comment, all I can say is I agree. There's nothing wrong with there being more old people in the world. I think of it this way. The world has to work out a system in which it has more or less 4 equal parts of distribution. Those who are too young to work, those who are of working age, those who are beyond working age, and those who are not yet born. And somehow we have to distribute the world's wealth among these 4 generations in some sensible way. That's the relatively democratic, relatively egalitarian world. If we can do that, if we can figure out how to do that, we're in a situation we've never been in historically, and it's a good situation to be in. That I think of as buen vivir.
Köszönjük szépen, azt mondom, az illendőség azt követeli. Mint elkezdeni tudjunk valamit, talán befejezni is. Nagy megtiszteltetés volt a Politikatörténeti Alapítvány is Intézet számára, hogy Immanuel Wallerstein a vendégünk lehetett. Köszönöm szépen a miniszter úr közreműködését ebben. És az MSZP elnökért nem eltitkolva, ezen a helyen nem úgy különben, ezért még nem róttak meg. Az MSZP elnök helyettesi közreműködését is abban, hogy erre a beszélgetésre is sor kerülhetett. Azt hiszem, hogy az a vágyunk, hogy merjünk átkérdezni a saját valóságunkra, külső segítséggel megtörténik. Van, aki talán radikálisabban is mer, mint ahogy mi hozzá vagyunk szokva a magunk tradícióihoz képest. Bátorság a kérdezésben, óvatosság a válaszadásban, ezt tanultuk most is, azt hiszem. Köszönjük szépen a részvételt mindenkinek!
Föl tudjuk vinni a könyvtárba?
Persze, hogyha lesz szerzés.
Még megy, most próbál, melyik a Zoom?
Nem tudom.